Hi, my name is Steve Squier, and this is the final project for FTT 104, the Firearms Tools Gunsmith Lab. In this course, what I'll be doing is breaking down my HK VP9 to its bare parts. Okay, before we begin this project, we must first render the firearm safe. So to do so, we're going to remove the ammunition source while lifting the slide catch, rack the weapon, make sure any ammunition that is taken out is collected. Then we're going to physically and visually check to make sure there is no ammunition source and there is nothing in the chamber. Our weapon is now safe. From this point, we'll field strip the weapon. So while pulling the slide back, drop the slide catch reliever, pull off the slide, pop out our spring and our barrel. The weapon is now field stripped. Before we progress any further, we want to ensure that there is no live ammunition in the workspace. This firearm was completely unloaded before we started, so we have no ammunition to remove. Okay, so the first step, we're going to go ahead and set aside the slide. We won't be needing that. The barrel, the spring, and the magazine. We're going to concentrate on stripping the grip. So the first step to do that is to take the slide catch out. So the slide catch lever, if we look in here, is this part right here. And when you look right there, you can see that when I manipulate the trigger back a little bit, that piece moves down, and that is what locks this into place. So by depressing the trigger just a little bit and then wiggling this out, we can remove the slide catch lever. Set it to the side. For the next step of the operation, we're going to be removing this roll pin here, which holds in our locking block. To do so, we're going to need a 1/8 inch roll pin punch and a hammer, and then of course my block to press against. So we're going to get right on into it. Okay, with that pin punched all the way out, pull it out while using the 1/8 inch punch to replace it, hold everything in place temporarily. And then we're left with this roll pin with this very serrated alligator looking texture with the roll pin on the inside as well, which is why we use a roll pin punch, so that we do not damage this combination of pins, and we can reuse them. Put them in our parts tray that we have handy and move on to the next step. Okay, for the next step, we're going to take out this pin. This pin holds the locking block in place as well, and it is a pin that is probably about 3/8 of an inch long, and it resides in this area of the locking block. So when we look in there with a flashlight, what we see is a little bitty nub. I don't know if I can get it on the camera. I can't see my camera view, but we have a little bitty nub in here which we have to push this way to push out of the frame here just a bit. It will be rather tight to do so because it's a polymer frame. It's nested in rather tight, and this weapon has not been broken apart to this level yet, so it is exceptionally tight. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, once we've been able to pop that out, we're left with the pin here. So we'll just get to our little pliers, grab hold of that pin, and slowly and carefully just remove it out of the polymer frame. And we're left with this guy right here. Put that in our parts bin and move on to the next step. Okay, our next step is to remove the ambidextrous magazine release. And to do that, we have to remove this clip right here that is a little plastic clip that snaps onto the bar. The bar of this magazine, this slide release is also the bar that goes right through, that has our trigger return spring attached to it. It does not come through on the other side, so it fits into a groove on the other side here in our locking block right here. And so what we're going to have to do is first remove this plastic pin. We can do that by taking our 1/8 inch punch that we used earlier, fitting it inside the hole here inside the plastic piece, and just simply pop it up and out, and it simply snaps on to the bar as such. Now that that's removed, it goes in our parts bin. We can then remove our slide release. Okay, for this step, to take out the slide release, we're going to have to use either our pick, or I prefer to use a very small flathead screwdriver and delicately get a little bit of space between the polymer frame and the slide release, so that we can just pull it out enough, being careful not to mar our polymer, and then we can start pulling it out with our fingernails. So you'll see we've created a gap over here. Now the only thing that's holding this in place is tension between the trigger assembly and the trigger assembly spring. All of the components in here are all attached, as well as the disconnector bar here. So when we pull this out, the disconnector bar here will be loose to come out, as will the spring. And so while we're pulling it out, we want to make sure and cover the spring to ensure that it doesn't pop out and become one of those items we're looking for. So there is our slide release, our disconnector, this little pin here is a real easy part to lose, and it resides in this component right here, so you have to be careful when you take it out. And then we want to go ahead and remove out our trigger spring, and we are just about done. Okay, next we're going to take our slide stop out, and if we look closely, we'll see this tiny little spring here. That is our slide stop spring. And so we'll go ahead and just slip it out. Super tiny little spring. Put it in our parts bin as well. And our slide stop will come up and out with it. Okay, the next step is to remove the trigger assembly. And so the trigger assembly will just lift up and out and come out in one large attached assembly. The next step of the strip is to remove the sear housing, which is here. And in this weapon, it is very easy to do so. So using our punch block again, and our 1/8 inch punch, roll pin punch, and now she's out. So you can see this one is also the textured roll pin, but the difference between this one and the other one, so that you can keep them separate, is the first one that we took out is a little longer and is not hollow. It has a roll pin inside there, whereas the sear block pin is hollow. I don't know if you can see through there, but it is hollow and a little bit shorter. So once we remove our roll pin, to take the sear housing out, we're just going to simply push it over and up, and then it should pop out relatively easy once we break it free of its little tight grasp there. So over and up, and the sear housing comes out. Our frame is now stripped. We'll set it to the side. And then now we'll take a closer look at the sear housing. Okay, so when we look at the sear housing, what we see is a few parts. So this is the ejector, and down here is the spring. So when you're doing a trigger job on this HK VP9, this is one of the springs that you will replace, which is going to give you a lighter and crisper trigger pull when you're releasing that sear. Now, something to be cautious of is that you can see that the main housing here is injected molded plastic. You can see the little injection markings here with a metal housing around it. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tapping out this roll pin here to remove the parts, and we need to be very careful when we do so, and also more careful when we're putting it back together, that we're not trying to push too hard or tap it in too hard to damage the plastic components. So to do that, just gonna simply bring our block back over with our 1/8 inch roll pin, which is all you need for this entire firearm. We're gonna go ahead and tap out this part. And I'm trying to find a good hole here in my block to give me a good background. And we'll start tapping it out. And out she came. So you can see it's just a standard roll pin. We'll set that to the side. Alright, go ahead and remove our punch that's holding it together. Alright, and from here what we'll be able to do is just simply slide out the plastic molded part from our metal casing. And then here is our sear. Okay, next, to further break this down, we're going to look at the sear a little closer. And what we'll find is that this is spring loaded, as you can see here. And it just came out. Okay, when we look at the sear housing here, you can see that it is spring loaded as such. I can get a good view of it this way. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing this pin here. And if you pay attention, you can see that on this side it's wider than it is on this side. So we're going to take our 1/16 inch punch into the smaller hole, and by hand we're going to be pushing it out this way so that we can remove this lever here. And it sometimes helps if you push down on the lever just a little bit to release some of the tension, and you can see that there's really no work at all needed to just push that pin right out of the way. I'm going to let my roll pin punch replace the pin so that nothing goes flying apart while I go ahead and secure the roll pin where I need it. And I can simply, being careful to keep everything depressed because it is under spring tension, remove my roll pin, and we have everything else coming out with the spring still attached. We have one final piece, which is this catch right here, and again it has a roll pin here, and so we simply go in from the back side and push that roll pin right out with no effort at all, just making sure that as we do so we catch everything coming out. There's that roll pin. It's smaller than the previous one we just removed, and then when we remove our punch we can take that component out as well. So let's go ahead and get everything laid out and we'll talk about what we've done. Okay, let's talk about what we've done and some of the parts that we're looking at. So we have our strip frame, so with all of our components taken out. From there, we have our locking block. Our locking block was held in place with our slide release lever, which is ambidextrous. So this is from the right hand side of the weapon. It goes through and retains the trigger on that bar. It also holds our disconnect lever and then goes through our trigger. This is our trigger spring, all the way through to the opposite side, which houses our ambidextrous left-hand slide release. This is our slide release spring. So when we go back to the locking block, we have this tiny spring here which goes behind this piece and this groove here to allow a little retention. We have our slide release lever. We have the locking block pin which goes through this hole and corresponds to this hole in the slide. And then we have our roll pin which goes through this hole and corresponds to this hole in the slide block. We come over to our sear. We have our main roll pin to remove the sear. Once we do that, we take out the main components, which is housed in the metal housing with our ejector. And then we have 3 roll pins and all of our sear component parts that come out of that. Now for reassembly, we're going to go in the reverse order. So we're going to go ahead and take this little guy here, slip it back in place where she was. And we've got a tiny hole here that we need to align. We're going to use our punch to help us align that, make sure that we have everything in place, wiggle it around, make sure that it's actually being held in the correct spot. And then we will go ahead and guide our pin back in place and just allow it to push the punch out of the way, and we're back in place for it. Go ahead and give it a good test to make sure that we did capture our piece in the right position. Next, we're going to go ahead and take this part. If you're doing a trigger job, this spring will be replaced with a lighter pull trigger. So we'll simply take the spring, and if you can see here, there's an indentation, round indentation where the spring goes. So we'll just push that spring into place. Then we're gonna, after we get the spring in place, we're gonna go ahead and push down and up to go ahead and get this tooth to fit in place underneath its place in the sear. And once we have that in place, we'll go ahead and guide the tip of it back down into position where it goes so that we can get our roll pin assembly down into place. Once we have the assembly in place, we're going to take our roll pin and go ahead and position it and just push it right into place with our fingers. No hammering needed in this part here. We can take our small punch and just, while applying a light pressure to depress the spring, go ahead and make sure that roll pin is seated all the way. You can't go too far because remember, the hole on this side is larger than the hole on this side. One thing of note is that you should cover this roll pin here, because this roll pin here is very loose and can come out freely. So while you're manipulating the rest of the parts, just simply hold it by the sides, pinch it so that the other roll pins don't come out of place. Now for the assembly to go back into its metal housing, it simply slides back into place. And what you'll notice when you're putting it in place is that there are a couple of grooves. So on this side, you have a groove on your metal here and a corresponding groove in the plastic. On the opposite side, you have a slot here on the metal and then a semicircle slot on the plastic that will go ahead and slide into place and secure everything inside the plastic housing like it should be. The next task will be to take our regular roll pin and reinsert it in the back. It may be easier to take a smaller punch than it once we get it positioned in place to guide through and make sure that all the components are in place. But essentially, if you have your plastic notches all held in place here, it will align your hole so that your punch or your pen should go all the way through like so. We're going to go ahead and bring our plastic block back into place. It holds my pen nicely so that I don't have to worry about holding the pen as I manipulate with the other two hands, getting my roll pin in place and starting to work it down into the hole by hand so I can get it straight and held in place before I need to start tapping it down. Now I can go ahead and remove everything. I like to use the polymer side of my hammer at this point to go ahead and get the roll pin started real good. Make sure that the polymer, it will get damaged, but the roll pin will not. And go ahead and tap this down. It's nice and flush. You can see on this side, we have a little bit of space inside, whereas this side is flush. So what I like to do is go ahead and tap this side down just to try to half the distance that we have over here between both sides. So again, using my 1/8 inch roll pin punch, I'm just going to give it a gentle tap. I felt it go down. I can feel it, there's a bit of a recess here. I can see that there's more recess on this side, so we'll go ahead and tap it down a little further. Like that. Our sear is now fully assembled and waiting for this roll pin to be used to secure it back into the frame. So you'll remember the sear will go with the ejector facing towards the barrel end, and it simply drops into place, has this tab that goes into a tab inside the frame. It simply snaps in and slides back into place. The polymer frame is somewhat tight, so you will have to finagle with it just a bit to get it to snap in and slide back and get a positive engagement with it locked in place. Like so. And then you'll be able to look through the frame with this hole here, and you can determine whether or not you need to go back or not, because you'll be able to see the locking pin. In this case, I can see it still needs to go back about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, we replaced our mat so that we can have a softer surface and not have to worry about marring our gun. I did want to remove it to give you a contrasting color for all of the parts that unfortunately get lost in the dark colored mat. So we're going to go ahead and replace the parts from the opposite side. So I like to tap them out from the left to the right. So we'll just take this roll pin and try to get it in place by hand as much as we can before we start tapping on it. And then again, taking my polymer side of my hammer, go ahead and gently tap the roll pin. I can see it takes no pressure at all to get tapped into place. If I feel any resistance, I want to go ahead and stop and check alignment. Now I've already made sure that I had clear alignment going through, and I can look through it again and still see that I have pretty clear alignment. Checking again, make sure that we're still aligned good, still looking good. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring my puck into place, give me a more firm grip. And once I get close, I'll go ahead and take my roll pin punch, which you'll notice the roll pin punch has an indentation on the end so that it goes inside the roll pin, making sure it doesn't collapse on itself as you're starting to get closer to where you need to be. And I'm going to go ahead and use that to tap it into place the rest of the way. Making sure that I have equal distance as it's tapped in here. It still sticks out just a little bit and not far enough here. So I'll go ahead and continue to tap that into place until I get it exactly where I need it. This is one of those cases where you want to go ahead and work slow. Tap a few times, check alignment, tap a few times, check alignment. Make sure that we have the spring in place where it's properly indented and not sticking out. If it is not in the right place, not only could it potentially start to wiggle out and stuff, but specifically this pin can really be a hazard to your hands as you're gripping the firearm and you have recoil. If that pin is sticking out any, it can cut the webbing of your hand. So we now have the sear assembly back in place, back in our frame. Okay, as we start to assemble the rest of the firearm, we're going to go in pretty much exact opposite order. So we have the left hand side slide stop. It's going to go in first, and a lot of these pieces will be placed in the firearm and left in place until the final pin goes in. It kind of holds most of it together. So we're going to go ahead and drop this piece in. Now, one thing to remember here is that this little bitty groove right here is where the little spring that we had earlier, can we see that on camera? There we go. This spring will reside inside this groove while held in place inside the firearm here. So it's one of the easier parts to lose because it's so tiny and something we'll need to be aware of. So once we put that in place, we're going to go ahead and drop our tiny screw in place. This is where some gun lube, sticky gun lube, can come into place and be handy. Alright, can we see there? Okay, the next step is to replace the trigger. So when we get the trigger assembly, we'll remember, as we put it down, careful of that little spring, that everything is in one assembly, but it is very loose, so you may have to position things in place to get them to seat correctly. But as we pick them up, go ahead and drop the trigger housing right down into place and get the spring into place. There we go. So of special note is how to locate the spring. So the trigger spring, if we can see on camera here, is right down in this area, and there is a little pocket in the firearm frame where that spring will poke into the pocket, and that's what we're trying to do. So if you look over here, you can see a position for the spring, and you can see a little bitty hole where we're going to go ahead and position the bottom of that spring to make sure that we have everything in place the way it should be. And again, we're watching the slide release spring very carefully as we do this so that it doesn't come out of place. Okay, now that we have everything in place, you can see that the trigger spring there, the tail of it does poke into the pocket, which secures it in the exact spot you want it to be in. Now we'll move on to the next step. Alright, next we're going to be taking this bar, making sure that this little tab here goes to the rear, the teardrop part goes up front as we lock it in place, and literally it just drops in on the outside of the trigger bar. And the only thing that's really important is to make sure that when we're doing it, this little tab fits underneath this tab here, which keeps it into place like so, and it just drops into place and sits there while we're waiting for our next step, which is to put our locking block into place. So with all of that in place, we're going to take our locking block and get it ready to go into place. Okay, this next operation can be one of the most difficult operations because of the German engineering with all of the small pieces and springs, such as this one here and that one there, and then everything is just held together by gravity at this point. So one of the things that we're going to need to do is work on getting this put back together while not separating the parts. So now I've got the firearm grip balanced between a punch set and my slide that's just kind of simply holding it in place so it doesn't tip over. Meanwhile, I've got my punch, 1/8 inch punch, in my punch block, and what that's going to do is hold everything into place to help me align this spring that goes into the pocket. There's no groove for this to capture the spring or anything. It's just simply a pocket. And so once I get that in there, I'm going to trap the long part of the spring with the detent on this clip, and then you rotate it until it falls into place. With some slight downward pressure, you can test to make sure everything's working. Now this is probably the most difficult task in assembling this firearm because this piece is held together with pressure only, and so you're going to want to take that out while maintaining the pressure and drop it into place right into the trigger assembly on top, allowing everything to fall into place, capturing the small spring, and now everything is held into place. The next challenge is to align everything. So to do so, you'll take your punch again, I'm going to start with a smaller one, and start to move all of the pieces that we've just put into place, making sure that we have them all lined up properly so that when we put everything in for the final go around, we have no challenges. Now we're going to take our right hand side slide release and slip it into the hole that we've just aligned. Okay, before we go any further in putting this into place, now that we have everything aligned, we're going to go ahead and go to the other side of the weapon, and we're going to take that small pin, remember that it has a smaller and graduating to bigger position, and we're going to put the smaller side into the frame and go ahead and press that into place, locking the locking block into place. So it'll press in by hand most of the way, and you may need to tap it after that gently with your polymer side of your hammer to get it into place. So we'll do that now. Okay, so now our locking block is secured. We'll go ahead and consider our next step will be to, we can go ahead and secure this alligator clip into place before we apply the trigger spring or anything. So we'll go ahead and, while we just push this through for now to hold everything into position, we'll go ahead and put this alligator style roll pin back into place. Again, we're going to come to the opposite side of the firearm, the side we took it out of. We're going to put it back. Get it started by hand as much as we can. And go ahead and tap it into place using the polymer side of our hammer. Making sure that we're not damaging it. Check sporadically to make sure everything remains aligned properly. Okay, once we have the slide release from the right hand side of the weapon put in place, holding all of the small pins in place and starting to protrude through this area here, or use a punch through this area here, it's time to put our springs in place. Again, this is a very challenging part of the operation. When doing a spring replacement kit to lessen the pressure of the spring or the trigger pull, the newer springs are much easier to put in place than the factory springs. This is a factory spring going back into the weapon. It is much more difficult to put into place than a replacement spring. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, the next operation, and quite possibly the second most challenging part of this operation, is to replace the trigger recoil spring. So to do so, there's a few things to remember. One, that has a long end and a short end. So if we're going to examine the spring here, what we will see is that you have a long tail and a short tail. Now when you put this down into the weapon, the long tail will reside on the frame, and there is a groove here that you can see for the frame, and the short tail will go down onto the trigger. Now replacing it with a reduced recoil spring is much easier to do than replacing it with the stock. This is the stock, so it's going to be a challenge. One of the things that I've read that can help is to take some electric tape and wrap it around your needle nose pliers with the sticky side out to help you get a good grip on the recoil spring. And I'm sorry, not the recoil spring, but the trigger spring. You're going to grip it like such, and see, here's where some of the challenges are, is it doesn't want to stay into place. Alright, grip it like such, get a good grip on it, and then go ahead and start placing it down into where it goes. Now the challenge with this is you're going to have to compress the spring as you're moving it into place, and this is sometimes quite a bit of a challenge to do. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. See, you'll see at the recoil spring, the legs are almost exactly sticking out the same place, and you're having to separate them as you're jamming it into place. With the lighter recoil springs, this tail is pointing off more in this direction, so it allows you a little more ease to get that separation that you need here, that you just really have a hard time doing with the factory spring. So we're going to continue working on this until we can get this into play. Okay, once you have the trigger recoil spring properly seated, which is extremely difficult to do with the factory recoil spring, you want to go ahead and capture it using the slide release. So now we're going to go ahead and get the slide release up. It's already through the recoil spring, And remember that it had a kind of a plus sign or a crosshatch design so that it could capture the other side. You twist it to where it gets proper where it's supposed to be. It's snapped into place. You can see that it works just fine. And then we'll capture it with the little plastic retention clip that simply goes right on top and snaps down into place with just a little bit of pressure. Now your lower is assembled, with the exception to your slide catch, which you'll remember just simply goes right into play here. Push your trigger down just a little bit because it's what captures it in place, and then it is assembled. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the slide. Okay, for the slide, you'll remember that we took off the recoil spring and pulled out the barrel. We'll go ahead and set them to the side. They're not needed for this operation. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to get our little pick here, and we're going to move in this section right here. So we're going to pull the safety switch out of the way so it's not allowing the hammer or the striker to move forward until our trigger has been pulled. When you pull the trigger, it moves this hammer block out of the way, allowing the striker to move forward like such in this direction to go ahead and discharge the rounds. Okay, the next segment. So we're going to take our pick, and this is the safety that prevents the firing pin from striking until the trigger is pulled, so the firing pin block. So we're going to move it out of the way, and you can see our firing pin here. There is a spring, and you can see the firing pin moves in this direction. The firing pin in the VP9 is held into place with a sleeve. It comes polymer or plastic from the factory. A lot of enhancements make them metal, and that is what holds the back plate in. So we're going to move this safety out of the way. With a 90-degree pick, we're going to grab that plastic piece and pull it backwards, or pull it towards us. And when we do that, it should go ahead and allow us to, let's get that pulled back. It's really tight. It should allow us to remove the back piece like such. Put your finger over the back to make sure that you don't have any parts come out, because they are under extreme compression, and then slowly allow the pieces to come out. Alright, there is our striker, or our firing pin, and the plastic assembly that I was talking about that is used to hold that into place. What you can do is you can depress this down like such. The goal is to get this depressed so that you can get this collet piece out of the way. It's two plastic pieces holding this into place. Now this will be under extreme pressure, so you want to be careful when you do this. So you can go ahead and depress down within the slide like such, and go ahead and pull those pieces out. Now a lot of guys will use a patch to do this so that it is a little easier on the fingers. I'm going to use a rag, so we'll just pull it down, depress as much as we can, and slip that out of the hand. There we go. And then we can get this two plastic collets out of the way, 1 and 2, then slowly allow our spring to come out. Now we can take the spring off, and we can take and push the firing pin out of the little plastic piece along with the firing pin's little spring there, and we have fully disassembled the firing pin and striker component of the HK VP9. So again, this is a part that's commonly replaced, and you can see the damage as we look closer right here, as that piece is starting to show wear. So that'll be something that we replace soon with a metal component. Typically it's anodized aluminum that they use. So for reassembly, we'll just go in reverse, make sure and put our little spring back on here, I'm going to go ahead and wipe it down while we have it disassembled into such a bare component. Make sure it's nice and clean. At this point, for troubleshooting, you can look and see if your firing pin is showing any kind of signs of wear. Let me go ahead and reassemble it back in. Slip it back into its plastic collet. Now, one of the more challenging operations will be to compress this spring back down over the firing pin, and then hold it in place while it's compressed enough to get these two halves of this plastic collar that will hold the firing pin into place. And you can see that this section here, the skinny section, will go underneath the spring, and then the flanged end will go over the spring, not allowing it to pass over this flange. So we're going to start compressing. And it does make it a lot easier to do when you have either a rag or a cleaning patch, so that trying to prevent this from pinching your skin. This is the part where if you do not have a positive control on this spring could fly out of control. Protection is highly recommended. And we'll go ahead and pause this for time constraints to allow me to get this component back into place. Now again, a trick in putting this back together is to simply slide this in the groove that it came out of, but in the wrong direction, allowing the sear pin to rest on the back of your slide here, which will keep or prevent your firing pin from pressing downward in this direction. That's what we don't want to do. That way we can get full compression with the firing pin fully exposed. So you just simply put it in the slide backwards and then use your gloves to compress the spring, or your rag or your cleaning patch to compress the spring, and then slip the collets back into place. Once they're back into place, you can take the firing pin, turn it back around in its original position, take this little safety piece out of the way, so make sure it's all compressing, so you can grab with your 90-degree hook and pull back on the plastic collet and place your rear piece back into place. This is also one of the things that causes the damage to this plastic piece, in my opinion, is not only the wear and tear of it, but the moving or compressing of this in this direction, when really the only thing that you can use to do that is this little plastic collet piece right here that's barely exposed. Drop your back piece in, and your slide is now back together. Your striker is now back in. Now to reassemble the firearm, HK super easy. Align everything. Oh. Now to reassemble the firearm, HK is super easy. You drop the barrel back into place. You take the the recoil spring, and you snap it into place. And you simply align the rails, lock it on. Make sure that your switch is facing the rear of the gun, and the firearm with an empty magazine works. Slide release or slide catch works. Slide release works. Striker works. Firearm is back into operational order.